I'm going to talk mostly about the robots that we have right now, but I also want to mix that discussion in with speculation about intelligent robots in the future. And in particular, while I'm going through my talk, I'd like you to consider a question. And the question is simply this. Imagine that you have a really intelligent robot in your house, for instance, in the future, and you come to switch off your robot at the end of the day. And my question is this: how would you feel if your robot said to you, "Please don't switch me off"? Don't answer that question now. I'll come back to it. But that is essentially is the question that I'd like you to keep in your minds as we're going through. A little bit of housekeeping from me as well, and that is that I'm very, very happy for you to ask questions or argue with me at any time during the talk. This isn't a kind of standard school-type lecture where, you know, I talk at you and you sit quietly and maybe we have some questions at the end. The problem with that is that if you have a really good question, you know, it's quite hard to keep it to the end. So please interrupt me as we go through. That's perfectly fine. I'm quite happy about that. Okay, the Bristol Robotics Lab. Here is a picture of it. It's one of the largest robotics labs in Europe, in fact, possibly the world. We're not sure necessarily, but I'll tell you what, is it possible to dim these lights at the front just a little bit? Great. Oh, thank you. As if by magic. That's great. So that's perfect. Yes. And in fact, you can see, how do I, yeah, that's great. This thing here is our arena for conducting experiments in swarm robotics. And I'm going to talk about swarm robotics a lot more during the talk. But I just wanted you to kind of get a feel for what a robotics lab looks like. These guys here are robots, and you can see that they are moving around in this arena, and they're pushing around. Can anybody, the children in the audience, can you tell me what those are, do you think? These little things, yeah. Like pucks. Pucks. Well, yeah, you're right. In fact, we do often call them pucks, but in fact they're frisbees. So, but we're using them as pucks, that's right. So the robots are actually pushing around these kind of frisbee-like things. So in the Bristol Robotics Lab, we build robots. We design and build robots. But these are not robots for practical, kind of immediate practical purposes. So most of the robots in our lab are research robots. In other words, they're robots that we design and build purely to research the principles of robotics. These are not robots that are intended to be used in industry or, I think, is that me? I think it is. I think there must be a loose connection or something on. It's going to be slightly disturbing if it keeps doing. Immediate practical application. They might be used for some, they might, we hope, be useful at some future time, but these are not robots that are designed to work in the real world immediately. And you'll see why that is as we go on. Okay. It's life, Jim, but not as we know it. The kind of robots that we build in our lab are often not called robots. We tend not to use the word robotics. we tend to use the words artificial life. And sometimes we shorten that to a life. And the point is that the robots that we build are what we call biologically inspired. In other words, these are robots that some part of the robot is designed or modeled or inspired by nature. This is a new way of doing robotics. It may seem strange to you for me to say this, but until perhaps 15 years ago, robots, and most robots, of course, were the kind of machines that you see in assembly lines, car, manufacturing plants, or warehouses. Most robots were designed to look or behave nothing at all like animals. Whereas during the last 10 or 15 years, this new kind of robotics that we call biological robotics is where we, if you like, we take a very kind of humble approach as engineers, and let me say that I'm an engineer, and we say to ourselves, look, nature has produced some pretty amazing designs, hasn't it? And we here, sitting here, we are the product of some of those astonishing designs in nature. But of course, we're just one species among millions of species on the planet. And this new kind of robotics that we do in our lab, called biological robotics, not only takes inspiration from nature, but in fact actually models not the whole robot, but certainly parts of the robot on designs from nature. And it models those parts of robots in a very deep way. Now let me show you some of those aspects. The first thing I should say is that robots don't have to be great big machines with computers and lots of electronics and so on. They can often be very simple, but simplicity doesn't mean that robots aren't interesting. Here's a little robot called SolarBot, and he's like a little insect, and he consists of two motors, and the two motors provide the left and the right wheel, and there are two wings. You can see those wings. Well, in fact, those wings are actually solar panels. So those wings actually generate electricity from the sunlight. Now, the amazing thing is, and let me say we have no electronics in this robot. There is no computer in this robot. All we do is that we connect the left-hand wing to the right-hand motor, and the right-hand wing to the left-hand motor. And by cross-connecting in that way, which is something, that's something at the end of the movie, so I'll start it again. Something that we notice in insects is this cross-coupling left to right. And you can see that if you do that, then the robot can go around obstacles on its own, which is amazing. And it can do that because, of course, the wing that's in the sunshine makes the opposite motor run, whereas the wing that's not in the sunshine doesn't get any electricity, and therefore that opposite wheel doesn't move. So hence you get this beautiful insect-like avoidance or kind of finding its way through a maze behavior. I don't know. I'll start that again. Almost for free. And this is a very, very simple example of what I mean by taking inspiration from nature, making little kind of insect-like robots, and kind of starting again. You can see here the robot actually finds its way through that maze, all on its own, without having any brain. That robot does not have a brain. And what's important about this observation is that smart behavior, intelligence, what is intelligence? Well, a nice way of thinking about intelligence is this. It's doing the right thing at the right time, whatever that is. So this little robot that goes through here is able to do the right thing at the right time, even though it doesn't have a brain, which is amazing. You don't need to be super smart. You don't have to have a brain in order to do the right thing at the right time. And this kind of realization that you don't have to have a very complicated brain in order to behave intelligently is a remarkably recent realization. It was only in the mid to late 1980s that artificial intelligence researchers and roboticists realized that you didn't need to have a big complicated brain to act smart. And one of the reasons, the trick, if you like, that these particular researchers realized is that, how can I put this? The world itself provides the complexity you need to do the right thing. Let me try and explain what I mean, because that may sound a bit obscure. Before the mid-1980s, hello, welcome.
Hi, sorry,
that's all right. Before the mid-1980s, robots were pretty hopeless. You couldn't make a robot that did the kind of thing that this little solar bot does. And the reason for that is that the guys who made the robots put computers inside the robot and tried to build complicated models of the world. So the robot would somehow try and represent the world in its brain and then try and figure out what to do in the world. So robots then were incredibly slow and, well, hopeless, because they would sense the world and then they would go and kind of plan what to do next from this internal model, or what we call representation of the world in the robot's brain. And then they would act. Oh, right, go forward. And then they would stop. Oh, of course, because they'd moved, then their sensory inputs have all changed. So then they have to go right back to their internal model of the world and replan what to do next. So hence, the robots pre-1986 or 1987 were extremely slow and cumbersome because of this problem that it was believed at that time that a robot, to be smart, had to have a model of the world in its head. Wrong. You don't have to have a model of the world in your head. And as I say, this little robot up here, that quite literally has no brain, can still... I'll start again from the beginning. How do I do that? Can't, this little robot that has no brain does the right thing because, and this is the beautiful realization, because the world is its own representation. You don't need to have a model of the world in your brain because you've got the world right here. So you can act and react to the world without having to have a model of it. And this was a new kind of robotics, which is referred to as behavior-based robotics. And this really heralded this new thinking in robotics, which we call artificial life. Okay, I'm now going to bring us much more up to date. This was kind of 10 years ago. This one here was 2 years ago. And this robot here is one of the robots in our lab, and it's called EcoBot 2. Now, this is a very special robot. Let me tell you that we're very good in our lab at building robots that don't have things. So I mentioned earlier that this robot up here doesn't have a brain. Well, this robot here doesn't have any batteries. Now, here's the thing. what's the point of being smart if your batteries run out? No point at all. So most roboticists, people who design and build robots, are interested in robots that can do the right thing at the right time. In other words, intelligence. But in our lab, we're equally interested in energy. How do robots get energy from their environment? Now, I already showed you a simple example. This guy up here, SolarBot, is a robot that gets energy from its environment. Let me get it so that you can actually see it. So this gets energy using these little wings here that are solar panels. Now, what happens if it's dark? Well, that robot clearly is dead. It's not going to work if it's dark. We set ourselves in our lab a very difficult task, which is that we wanted to build a robot that could actually eat food. And ideally, we wanted to build a robot that would be able to predate. In other words, actually get energy, actively get energy from its environment. Now, one of the first robots that we tried to build, which was not very successful, was called the SlugBot, because it was a robot that could find slugs. Well, we successfully built a robot that could find slugs, but the problem was, how does it eat them? And we realized that that was incredibly difficult, because traditionally, well, I say traditionally, nobody's really done this, but the conventional thinking was that if you have slugs, for instance, the way you get energy from slugs is that you effectively ferment. Sounds horrible, isn't it? Well, it is horrible, really. Ferment the slugs so that they rot, and then you get biogas from the sort of fermenting slugs, and then you burn the biogas in a fuel cell, and then you generate electricity from the fuel cell. And that's a very complicated process. And we started to do that, and we abandoned that. We decided that was just too difficult. So instead, we came up, well, we didn't invent it, but we developed these things here. Now, these little things here, you can see one there, and one there, and one there. And in fact, there's a ring of these all the way around this robot. And these are called microbial fuel cells, or MFCs, microbial fuel cells. And they're really amazing devices, because they're batteries that run on food. So most batteries, as you know, most batteries get their electricity from chemical energy, effectively from chemical, purely inorganic chemical processes. The kind of battery in your watch or your car generates electricity from chemical energy. Instead, in these little fuel cells, what we do is that we digest food. And the product of digestion actually generates electricity. In fact, these batteries, just like a regular battery, the normal battery that you're familiar with, these batteries have two terminals called an anode and a cathode. The only difference is that in fact, it's the cathode is actually dipped into a chamber that contains an enzyme solution. And essentially, there are microbes in that enzyme solution that can break down food. And when they break down, they metabolize the food. Proteins, essentially, are broken down. One of the products of that of the breakdown of food is cations, well, basically protons. And those particles can cross a membrane between the anode and the cathode, and hence you get electricity. Effectively, we steal electricity from the product of digestion, literally digestion. Now, here's the really cool thing. we started by using E. coli as the bacteria to break down the food. And our first experiments used sugar, refined sugar. Well, that's not really very good for us because we wanted to use unrefined food. And then somebody suggested that we should use sewage sludge. This is really horrible to even think about. So this is basically the same kind of stuff that's used in sewage treatment plants. Now, it's great stuff. It's good stuff because it has a very rich kind of, flora and fauna. It has an extremely rich set of bacteria that will break down a huge, wide spectrum of, well, foodstuffs, basically. And when we switched to using, so basically these little batteries here, these biological batteries that we call microbial fuel cells have little bits of sewage sludge inside them in the little chambers. And then we tried out different kinds of food, like apple cores and, bits of fruit and stuff. And by trial and error, we discovered that the kind of food that works best in these batteries is actually chitin. Now, chitin is a bit like your fingernail, but it's the exoskeleton of insects. So we discovered, for instance, that prawn skins, not the insides of the prawn, but the actual outsides, the bit you throw away, prawn skins work really well in these batteries. But the thing that works best of all is dead flies. Not the insides, dried, hard, dead flies work the very best of all. And this, therefore, EcoBot 2 is the world's first fly-eating robot. And it's amazingly good at eating flies. In fact, this one has 8 fuel cells, and we quite literally put one dead fly. Of course, we don't actually, we don't catch the flies. We just go and find them, on windowsills and stuff like that. And we put one dead fly in each fuel cell, so the robot runs on 8 dead flies. In fact, it runs continuously for 12 days on 8 dead flies. It has no batteries, no other forms of electrical storage. Now, that's the good news. The bad news is that it's the world's slowest robot. And here is a little movie of this robot moving. And it goes at around 12 centimeters per hour. So it's really slow, but it's a bit like an insect or a lizard in that it has to kind of store up some energy, and then it uses it in a burst. And then it waits and then stores up some more energy from digestion, and then uses that in a burst again. So this is a kind of time-lapse video of this robot. What's it doing? Well, it's moving towards the light. Well, that's not particularly amazing to move towards the light. What's amazing is that it's powered entirely by dead flies in moving towards the light, and it's kind of doing it rather slowly, hence the clock in the background.
Is that because it knows where the flies are going to be by the light?
Well, no, that's the next robot, yes, EcoBot 3. In fact, while we're waiting for that movie to continue, I'll just tell you about EcoBot 3, which I can't show you because it's kind of secret. We haven't actually got any pictures of it yet. But the thing about these microbial fuel cells right now is that they stop working after a while. In other words, you put a dead fly in, then it takes 12 days to digest. It literally disappears. You don't have to mash it up or anything. You put the entire dead fly in, and after 12 days, it's gone. It's been digested. And if you keep doing that over the course of perhaps 3 or 4 months, eventually the fuel cell stops working. Now, the reason for that is because waste products build up. waste products from digestion build up in the fuel cell itself and effectively poison the bacteria that actually break down the food. And when that happens, of course, the fuel cell stops working because the very bacteria that you need no longer, they're killed basically by the waste products. So how do we get around that? Well, what we need, of course, is a fuel cell with a sort of flow-through system that's able to get rid of the waste products. You can kind of see where I'm going here, can't you? And in fact, as we speak in our lab, we're just prototyping. It isn't built yet, but we've got most of the parts that we're beginning to assemble EcoBot 3. And EcoBot 3 has two big advantages over EcoBot 2. One is that the fuel cells have a continuous flow-through system, and that means that it'll be the world's first robot that poos. And the other improvement on EcoBot 2 is that it also has a component at the top of the robot that catches flies. So we don't have to feed it. Now, how does it catch flies? Very simple. We've designed a part of the robot that is just like a pitcher plant. Do you know what a pitcher plant is? Yeah. So it's a component of the robot that has a special kind of pheromone inside it that attracts flies. So the great thing is we don't have to catch the flies. We just make ourselves attractive to them, so they come to us. So robots fall into the kind of component at the top of our EcoBot 3, and then they'll be digested, and that's fine. So it's a kind of robotic pitcher plant. So you can see that this is really, it's not just inspiration from nature, but we're actually borrowing designs. And you can see that this is a different kind of robotics. This is not robots made out of big machinery and machined metals and so on. In fact, the new EcoBot 3 is almost entirely plastic. So we're using a new technology called rapid prototyping so that we design the robot, parts of the robot, and then print them on a 3D printer. It takes about a day or so to print most of these parts. So that'll be pretty amazing, and we're hoping that that will be ready in about 6 months. But we have to be careful, of course, because journalists love this stuff. And the problem is that journalists will, if you're not careful, will make you, well, they won't make you, but they want you to tell the story before you've actually done the work. And of course, there's a big danger in this kind of work that we don't want to be accused of kind of hyperbole or making claims that we cannot substantiate, because clearly we're a serious university research lab. But look out for that in the press in about 6 months. So that's EcoBot 2. Any questions about that before I move on to WhiskerBot? No? Yeah, did you no? Okay. We hope it will do, yes. Yes, because we're constantly improving. That's a very good question. We're constantly improving the design of the fuel cell. In fact, this thing here, the black thing here, is actually the anode. And in fact, this anode is open to the air, and it collects oxygen from the air. And we discovered just a couple of weeks ago that if we put this open anode under a flowing tap of water, then the fuel cell actually works better with flowing water over the anode. And we discovered actually that would be really good for underwater robots. So another one of the researchers in the lab has just made a boat with a set of fuel cells where the anode sections of each of the fuel cells is under the hull of the boat. And that'll power the propeller. So it'll be the world's first fly-eating boat, in fact. Yeah.
I wasn't here at the beginning. first thing that you would like to use this for? What would you?
That's a great question, and you've reminded me that I was going to say that. My vision for this kind of technology is this. I mean, there are lots of possible applications, but I mean, I'm a pretty hopeless gardener, and I would love to have a little robot, or maybe 2 or 3 little robots that live in my garden. So what I would like to have is little robots that kind of live in the garden, and they not only do the weeding, but actually eat the weeds. So they're smart enough to know which are the good plants and which are the weeds. So they run around in the undergrowth in your flower beds and pull the weeds and munch them up and eat them. And, you know, for extra protein, you know, slugs or whatever as well, the pests. And then they poo fertilizer. So you have 2 or 3 maybe of those little robots that live in your garden. That sounds pretty nice to me as well. I mean, that sounds a bit, you know, you might think, well, that's just stupid. But a more serious application is this. Did you know that the highest concentration of rare metals and rare materials is not underground in mines or ore or anything? Do you know where it is? It's in waste dumps. So the highest concentration of rare metals like cadmium, for instance, or mercury, or, you know, gold, is in tips. And of course the world, sadly, is full of large tips, of rubbish tips, basically. You know, that most rubbish is buried. So actually, a really good application for a robot would be a robot that could forage for rare metals in a rubbish tip. Now, it's a pretty horrible place to be, isn't it? But wouldn't it be great if the robot could burrow around and forage for the material that you ask it for? You bring me some cadmium, you know, and it forages around. But while it's at it, it might as well eat whatever stuff that you don't even want to think about is in the rubbish tip and actually get its power from that. So, you know, it would be really nice. I mean, personally, I think...
Do you see the commercial application in the first place for it?
Well, I don't know. I mean, you know, I'm really just wildly speculating because, again, as you missed this at the very beginning, I said that these robots that we build in our lab are, if you like, at the very, very first concept stage of testing out what we call a fundamental technology or a fundamental basic technology. Ours is not, you know, we don't regard it as a part of our job to then commercialize and exploit or whatever these robots. I mean, underwater robots might be fantastically important for things like pollution control, environmental monitoring, even robots that can, you know, do very, very dangerous work at the bottom of the sea, you know, where there are oil wells, for instance. I mean, at the moment, divers have to go down. It'd be much better if robots could do that. And it would be better if the robots could get their energy themselves without having to be powered by batteries. Please.
If we rely on robots too much and like they all stop working for some weird reason, that might make humanity collapse in the future.
That's a very good question. But what I mean, my response to that is, aren't we already in that situation? I mean, if you know, all of our motor cars and televisions and fridges and electrical power networks and water distribution networks, if all of that suddenly stopped working, we'd be really in trouble right now, wouldn't we?
Well, what I mean to say is like some people are thinking of making your car drive for you.
Yeah.
And what if like all the cars stop, then there'll be havoc because people can't drive.
Sure.
They just lost their favourite car or something.
Well, you're right. You're absolutely right. I mean, but in a sense, I think my answer to that is not to deny what you're saying. I think what you're saying is absolutely right. But simply to say that in a sense it's too late. You know, we as a you know, certainly in the developed West, you know, we're already utterly dependent on technology. most of us, most people sitting in this room, I doubt if there's a single one of us that could hunt for our own dinner. Most of us get our dinner from a supermarket, you know, where it's pre-prepared and pre-butchered and pre-packed and everything. It may even be pre-cooked. But how many of us could actually go into a forest and get our own dinner? So in a way, I mean, you're right, but all I'm saying is that, you know, actually we're already dependent on technology, on actually a very high level of technology. And so actually robots don't, in my view, make much difference to that dependency. It's, in a sense, I'm saying it's already too late. You know, we're far too, you know, we're already hooked, if you like, on high technology. At least we are in the developed countries. Please.
Can I ask a question about your fuel cell?
Sure, yeah, please do.
You said it's going to eat flies,
Mm-hmm.
and you talked about it constantly flushing itself. But doesn't that kind of imply that it's going to need a source of more fluid or water or something like that?
Yeah, good question. I can't answer that, I'm afraid, because it's not a project that I'm deeply involved in. It's a big lab. We have about 50 people in the lab, 50 researchers. And although I know about the project at a sort of superficial level, what I can't tell you about is the design, the detailed design. Not because I won't tell you, but simply because I don't know. But you're right. And I think one of the big challenges is that a robot that has effectively a sort of artificial alimentary canal, you need energy. I mean, you know that our alimentary canal has a process called peristalsis, which is essentially where muscles are constantly squeezing all the way down. You know, I don't want to go into too much detail. But again, those muscles need energy. Well, every time we build extra complicated processes into the robot, then we need more energy. And because these fuel cells generate very tiny amounts of electricity, in fact microwatts of power, then, you know, we have to be extraordinarily careful, you know, with that energy. So yeah, good question. I'm sorry I can't. It may well be that we haven't actually figured that out yet. So please.
Would you say that your field, especially Ecobot and whatnot, is it related to nanobot technology? Do you see the two fields overlapping or supplementing each other?
Sure, that's right. And in a way, I think I'll come on to sort of nanobots, because in some respects, what we're designing and building here are kind of principles that could be scaled up or scaled down. And one of the things about nanobots, I mean, most nanobots are just proposed, you know, it's a technology that doesn't really exist properly. But the thing that you can be sure about with a nanobot is that you will have very, very limited resources, tiny amounts of power, tiny amounts of electricity, tiny amounts of computation, of sensing, of motors, and so on. So your robots have to be minimalist. Now, one of the features of oh, I don't know where we've gone, screensaver, presumably, let's come back. One of the features of these robots is that some of them, at least the SolarBot and the EcoBot, tend to be minimalist. So in a sense, by making robots that are very simple, then that helps you when you scale down from a robot that big to kind of a robot that big. But the principal difficulty with nanobots is, what do you make them out of? And although there is work in using VLSI, in other words, silicon engineering technology, the same kind of technology that's used to make the components in your PC, the problem is that the silicon is still too big. I mean, the processor, the main CPU in your PC at home, is a couple of centimeters square. Well, that's not nano. You know, nanobots are much smaller than that. So we have this kind of strange situation where you can make motors that are much smaller. In fact, you make motors that are much smaller than the computer that you need to control the motors. So it's kind of, you know, There's a paradox there which is not resolved. I mean, nanobots, in my view, will probably not be made out of silicon or metal, but probably made out of molecules that have been engineered. So I think bioengineering, and certainly you can see a kind of crossover and a convergence between robotics, which is at the moment fundamentally engineering, with biotechnology, which is where you're engineering out of molecules, and maybe cells, engineering out of cells, which is really scary stuff because that's where you're manipulating genes effectively. But let me move on, if I may, to Whiskerbot. How are we doing for time, Kenny? Okay?
I didn't actually notice what time the camera is. We probably started about
20 past.
20 past.
Yeah. So, okay. So, Whiskerbot. Now, Whiskerbot does have a more direct application than some of the other robots. The world is full of disasters, sadly, and many of those disasters involve collapsed buildings. So collapsed buildings either in war zones or from earthquakes, natural disasters. And the problem with collapsed buildings, of course, is it's very difficult to find and then rescue people who are buried inside collapsed buildings. So wouldn't it be great if you could have robots that could go into the very small cracks and spaces in the collapsed building and search the building in a way that human beings can't do? Well, an animal that's very good at that is a rat. The thing that rats are particularly good at is finding their way in dark and confined spaces. And although rats have eyes, they don't really use their eyes very much. The thing that they use most is their whiskers. And you may not know this, but rats, like all rodents, their whiskers actually whisk. So their whiskers do this. Did you know that? Cats and dogs don't. Cats and dogs have fixed whiskers. But rats and other rodents like gerbils and hamsters and so on can actually move their whiskers, and they can feel their environment with their whiskers. And in fact, if you look at the rat's brain, the rat uses as much brain for its whiskers proportionally as we do for our vision. So it sees the world with as much fidelity and as much accuracy as we do with our vision, but it uses its whiskers. And whiskers are fantastic for dark, confined spaces. So what we set out to do here is to build a robot with whiskers. And this is really new. This video was taken just a few weeks ago. And here is our first prototype of Whiskerbot. He's appearing from the top right-hand corner. And you can see at the moment he only has 2 whiskers. But they're whisking, you can see nicely. And you'll see in a minute or two, you'll find that Tipex. No, not Tipex. Pritt stick, that's right, glue. Oh, there he is, he's found it. Just with his whiskers, doesn't have any camera or vision. And that's Whiskerbot. Now, there's a lot of machinery there, you can see that. And one of the reasons that there's a lot of machinery is because not only have we made artificial whiskers, in fact, these whiskers are about twice the size of real rats' whiskers. So not only have we made artificial whiskers, and this is really kind of a bit mind-boggling, really. We've actually copied the part of the rat's brain that processes the information from the whiskers. Our collaborators in University of Sheffield are experts in the wiring of rats' brains, particularly the bit of the rat's brain that processes the information from the whiskers. And this completely freaks me out. Not only do they understand that bit of the rat's brain, but they understand it so well that they've worked out the wiring. The actual neural wiring of the part of the rat's brain that processes the whiskers, they've worked out. And what we've done is that we've built that into electronics. Now, that's pretty amazing. But the problem is the rat, we're talking about a 1 millimeter little tiny piece of brain, which actually has about 40,000 neurons in it. The problem is that to make the equivalent in silicon, using our, pretty miserable electronics technology by comparison, you need this great big stack of stuff here. This whole thing here, which incidentally is about £100,000 worth of electronics, is the equivalent of that little 1 millimeter of rat's brain. So it's pretty humbling, really, isn't it? That we. So here, not only are we modeling the whiskers, but we're modeling the actual processing of the data from those whiskers. I'm going to I'm going to move on a little bit faster now, because I can see me spending another hour and a half, and then it'll be too late for questions. So that's the whisker bot. Again, you can see it's biologically inspired. It has a direct purpose, which is what I'd like to see in maybe 5 or 10 years' time, is that you go to a rescue team, international rescue. I love that, Thunderbirds and everything. Would go to a collapsed building, and they would have a swarm of perhaps 100 of these little robots with whiskers, and they would swarm into the building, and then the rescue workers would have a kind of laptop computer, and then automatically they would get a three-dimensional picture of the spaces inside the building and the location of survivors. So they'd then know exactly where the survivors are, and would be able to then start digging for survivors in a way that, is, well, properly, as opposed to, at present it's a dreadful sort of trial and error kind of process, which takes a long time. So that's WhiskerBot. I'm now going to move on to an area of my own research. So this is the stuff that I do, and this is called swarm robotics. And swarm robotics is based on the idea of swarm intelligence. So up to now, I've been talking to you about single robots. So SolarBot, WhiskerBot, EcoBot, they were single robots. I'm now going to start talking to you about multiple robots. And here,
in fact, we model our robots on ants. And here are some ants in our lab. In fact, we have ants in our lab as well as robots. And these are leptothorax. They live in two-dimensional cracks in rocks. And here, this is a kind of new nest site. And the robot, it's not robots, I nearly said robots, the ants, this is speeded up, are starting to build a nest. And then they're moving the larvae, the pupae, to the back of the nest, and these white things here are grains of sand. So the ants are, in fact, over time, are starting to build a wall at the front of the nest. And you can see time has gone on. The wall is pretty much complete. So here you can see the pupae, the larvae, and the wall. And at some point, I think it happened then, the queen ant is introduced to the nest. And the nest is effectively finished. There is the queen, right there. So the question is, from an engineering point of view, how do they do that? How do they do that? Well, we don't really know, but what we do know is that there is no brain ant. So there is no central brain ant directing or coordinating or planning the activities of all of the other ants. So each ant decides to do what it's going to do next entirely on its own, autonomously. Yet, somehow, amazingly, when you put them all together in their environment, you get these kind of structures. You get sorting of brood and sand. You get the construction of a wall with grains of sand, somehow without any central planning or coordination at all.
And that's a real puzzle. But you know, there are lots of examples in nature. Look at a flock of birds. Often a flock of birds can be huge. A flock of starlings might have thousands of birds in it, yet there is no air traffic controller. Self-evidently, there's no air traffic controller telling, you know, starling number 227 to turn 5 degrees left because you're going to bump into, you know, another. That doesn't happen. You know, shoals of fish, herds of mammals, swarms of insects. These are all examples of swarm systems where there is no centralized coordinator or controller. So in swarm robotics, what we're interested in doing is trying to both understand those principles and build artificial systems based on those principles. And I'm going to show you a few examples of those. Here is a view. You remember the slide at the beginning which showed the arena with the frisbees in it? Well, here is a kind of top-down view. And here are some white frisbees and some black frisbees, and the robots are here and here and here and here and here. And you can see we start the experiment with the frisbees all spread out evenly in the lab. This is speeded up. You can see that the robots are kind of sorting the frisbees so that they become clustered. And you can see that the robots, I'll stop it there, the robots here have clustered all the white frisbees together and left the black ones spread around. And the interesting thing to understand or to appreciate here is that the robots don't know they're doing that. The robots have simple rules or behaviors, and there's a kind of example on the right-hand side of those rules. And when you put those rules all together with the robots in their environment, you get this clustering behavior. And it's what we call an emergent behavior. It's an example of self-organization. And self-organization happens throughout nature. Nature is full of examples of self-organization. It's most kind of dramatic in ants, social insects. But actually, lots and lots of animals do this self-organization. I mean, why is it interesting? Well, because there's no central controller, then you have a system here that's incredibly robust to failures. So half of the robots can fail, but the rest will carry on and complete the task. So it's very, very robust, very tolerant to failures. Also, it scales up to larger systems. We've discovered that if you put twice the number of robots in the arena, it takes half the time to complete the clustering task. Somebody once came into the lab and said, how do the robots know when they've finished? It's a good question. In fact, the answer is they don't, because they don't know what they're doing in the first place. It's simply us as external observers that see the self-organization, see the clustering. So actually, it's we from the outside who see the changes, the ordering, if you like, the change of entropy, which is the scientific word for that, in that system. In fact, one of my colleagues who did this research, he was doing this research late at night, and this takes a long time, so he was reading War and Peace or something while he was waiting for an experiment to finish. And he left the robots running after a cluster had formed. And he left it so long that when he came back, the cluster had moved from one place in the arena to another place in the arena. And when we discussed this with ant biologists, the ant biologist said, that's amazing. Do you know, we've never understood why this happens. In nature, there's a particular species of ant that collects together leaf litter, dead leaves, and makes piles of dead leaves in the jungle, in a clearing in the jungle. And ant biologists for decades have noticed that when they come to a clearing and they see a pile of leaves collected by the ants. And then they come back, 2 or 3 days later, the pile has moved. Why is that? Ant biologists never understood this, and we provided the answer. The answer is simply that the ants don't know what they're doing. And just like our robots, they continue to mill around, and eventually they disturb the pile of leaves in the same way that our robots disturb the cluster of frisbees. And if they disturb it enough, then it becomes unclustered. So they carry on, and they end up forming a new cluster somewhere else. Blue tack is important to this story as well, because we discovered that the little piece of... We found that the cluster was forming in the same place in the arena every time. And again, we couldn't understand why that was until somebody discovered that one of the frisbees had a little tiny piece of blue tack stuck underneath it, which meant that it was a bit more sticky and had more friction to the floor. And it effectively was forming a seed frisbee that all of the rest then clustered around. So it's amazing, you find things with experiments with real robots that you can never find in computer simulation. I'm going to go a little faster now. We transferred that work to 3 dimensions. And here are some robots. In fact, I don't think these are movies. No. So these are helium aerobots. So these are little robots, lighter than air robots. The whole of the electronics here, so propellers, motors, batteries, computers, sensing, the whole lot, weighs less than 100 grams, which is quite difficult to build. And if I go to the next slide, this is the world's first demonstration of flocking in 3 dimensions with real robots, real flying robots. So you can see these robots are kind of following the leader, which is this one here, connected by a piece of string to a wheeled robot. And these guys are following that particular robot, trying to kind of swarm behind the leader. It's very difficult. One of the reasons it's difficult is because if somebody on the other side of the lab opens a door, that makes enough wind to blow these. These are very light robots. So typically we do these experiments in the middle of the night when there's nobody coughing or opening and closing doors. So that's in real time as well. That's not speeded up. So that's the world's first flocking in 3 dimensions with real robots. So I've talked about swarm robotics, and I'm now going to, and this is the final segment of the talk, I'm now going to talk about humanoid robots, human-like robots. This slide is called Into the Valley of the Uncanny. Humanoid, people who make humanoid robots, like this lady robot here called Eva, have noticed something about humanoid robots that's very interesting, and it's called the Valley of the Uncanny. And the easiest way to describe this is with a graph. So here's a little graph that demonstrates this, and it shows that as you make robots more human-like, they become more acceptable. So this is the axis of acceptability, how much you like the robot or accept the robot. So they become more and more acceptable until they become, you reach a point where the robot here is very close to human-like, but not quite. And then a very strange thing happens. You find that a robot that is human-like but not quite right becomes a bit freakish. And the thing about human beings is that we're so tuned in to facial expression and facial behavior that anything that's not quite right is scary. And that's called the Valley of the Uncanny. So robots that are very human-like suddenly become less acceptable until you climb out again of this valley. So this valley here is called the Valley of the Uncanny. And Eva is one of the world's most advanced robot heads. And in fact, actually, her head is completely empty apart from motors. So her head actually contains about 35 little motors, electrical motors. And those little electrical motors have wires on the motors that are connected to the back of the skin. So the skin on Eva's face, which in fact is a special kind of mixture of latex and rubber. In fact, I think it's called flubber or frubber or something like that, and has been patented. So the little motors have wires connected to the back of the skin such that they can push and pull the skin. Okay? So the motors effectively are muscles. But the problem is, of course, that 36 motors is a lot of motors. So actually, if you look at the back of Eva's head, there isn't much space for anything else. But nevertheless, they're pretty good. And in fact, the motors also drive her eyes, so her eyes can move. And even better, her eyes are actually cameras. Each eye is a real camera. Now, what are we using Eva for? Well, what we're trying to do here is an experiment in what we call artificial empathy. Now, humanoid robots will, we think, become increasingly important. They're already becoming important in Japan. Japan has a large elderly population, and the Japanese are very keen on using robots for care, as nursing robots, or home help robots, or kind of companion robots.